Well, should I just delay a little bit with a couple of really, jokes in very poor taste? We'll just have one really bad joke as people are coming in. So, why are so many people getting cremated now? Because it's their last chance for a hot body. I told you it was going to be bad. That'll teach you never to get here on time. Well, there was something about Daniel. What was that? Oh, anti-hero. There's a question from the back. Why is Daniel an anti-hero? Because I got the topic wrong. I thought they said anti-heroes, not anti-heroes. So the anti-heroes are the heroes from the Old Testament who are pointing forward to the Messiah. So anyway, I'm talking about Daniel, both the man and his book this morning. All right, so Daniel the man was born in Judea sometime around 620 BC. He was of an upper class family, and then he was taken from Jerusalem into exile in Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar sometime around 605 BC. So maybe he was a teenager, or maybe he was in his 20s. The 605 date is correct, but we don't really know the year of his birth. What Nebuchadnezzar did is he took the best and the brightest from Jerusalem and resettled them in Babylon. Let me just give you an idea about what would happen in Houston. What is Houston known for? Not oil and gas. Come on, all you oil and gas people. We have the best medical center in the world, right? Well, what if somebody came in and took away all of our surgeons, all of our researchers? Just think about the impact that would have on Houston. Well, that's what happened in Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar took the best and the brightest out of the city, and he resettled them in Babylon. Now, in the last verse of Daniel chapter 1, it says, "And David was there in Babylon until the first year of King Cyrus." So Cyrus became king in Babylon around 539 BC, meaning that Daniel likely lived into his 90s. So did you know that? So you're at a cocktail party, you can now say, how old do you think Daniel lived to be into his 90s? I learned that at St. John the Divine. That's why I go there, so I can learn all these interesting biblical tidbits. So Daniel then is the figure who links these two important rulers, Cyrus, who we heard about a couple of weeks ago, and Nebuchadnezzar. So from 605 to 539 BC. And this verse anticipates Daniel functioning throughout this period. So the book of Daniel is not that long. It's 12 chapters. It's not a detailed history account, but it does give us some really good ideas of what's going on in Babylon during that period. So the name Daniel means God is my judge. And he wrote his book in Babylon after the fall of Jerusalem and the deportation of the Jews to Babylonia. The book of Daniel is part of the historical record of Israel and is prophetic in what God's people can expect in the future. Just so you know, I'm going to talk more about the historical part rather than the prophetic part, but I will be getting into the prophetic part. So the central theme of the book of Daniel is God's sovereignty of history and empires despite Jerusalem falling to the Babylonians. So just think about this historical event. God has promised his people that he will what? He will be with them. He'll send them a Messiah and everything. And all of a sudden, God's people are almost destroyed. Their temple is destroyed. And the best and the brightest are moved out of the city. All kingdoms will ultimately come to an end, we learn in the book of Daniel, and be replaced by the kingdom of God. And of course, what does that look forward to? The coming of Jesus, the New Testament message, which is why the book of Daniel is so important to understanding Jesus and why he, Jesus, found himself in it as the Son of Man in chapter 7 of Daniel. So let's just briefly look at that. So this is from Daniel 7, beginning at verse 9. As I looked, thrones were placed, and the Ancient of Days took his seat. So Daniel has this vision that God is communicating to him, and there's a throne, and the Ancient of Days is God himself. And he takes his seat. His clothing was white as snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was fiery flames. Its wheels were burning fire. Think about the New Testament. When Jesus goes up on the mountain of transfiguration, how is he described? Kind of like this, like a blinding white light. A stream of fire issued and came out from behind him. And 1,000 thousands served him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. Why is this important to us? This is a vision of heaven. And how many people are there? Lots, right? That's important to us. We want to be part of that great number. The court sat in judgment, and the books were opened. I looked then because the sound of the great words that the horn was speaking. And as I looked, the beast was killed and its body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. As for the rest of the beasts, their dominion was taken away, but their lives were prolonged for a season and a time. So I'm not going to go into all of that, but there is a victory in heaven, and now here comes the moment that Jesus finds himself in this book. I saw in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, got to advance one. With the clouds of heaven, there came one like a son of man. And he came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. So here is this court. Here is the Ancient of Days on his throne, and in walks one like a son of man. What does that mean? Someone who is human, right? And to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. Whose kingdom is this? It's the kingdom of the Lord. This is Jesus' kingdom. And these scenes, where do we find them in the New Testament? In the book of Revelation. So Daniel and Revelation are tied together, and Jesus sees himself in this book. And we can believe in the book of Daniel because Jesus quotes from it, calls Daniel the prophet, and quotes from him. So the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem and transported its important citizens to Babylon as captives. And the first half of Daniel tells a series of stories about the Jewish captives living there centered around Daniel and his friends. Now, I don't know if you can really tell from that slide where Jerusalem is. It's that fuzzy one right above Judah. And then you can see Babylon across the side. So the route of them being taken into captivity is kind of an arch that goes from, let's say, 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock on that map where the Babylonian Empire is. So the first half of the book tells us stories about the Jewish captives, and then I'm going to look briefly at each of these stories and pull out some important points to share with you. However, let me first give you a bit more background. So deportation should not have come as a surprise to the people of God. He had repeatedly warned his people of the consequences of their immorality and unfaithfulness. So in Deuteronomy 28:6, "And the Lord shall scatter you among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other. And there you shall serve other gods of wood and stone, which neither you nor your fathers have known." So God's already made this promise that he will punish his people. There will be consequences to their sin. One thing I want you to notice here is I'm looking for this great word that I can't come up with, but we should never be literal when we're interpreting the Bible. "And the Lord will scatter you from among all peoples, from one end of the earth to the other." So where are the ends of the earth? It's just an expression. Because if you look on the map, they're not going that far. They're not being taken, like to California, right? So there's that promise. Later on in Deuteronomy, "All the nations will say, 'Why has the Lord done thus to this land?'" In other words, the surrounding people will say, "Why is God doing this to his people? What caused the heat of his great anger?" Then people will say, "It is because they abandoned the covenant of the Lord, the God of their fathers, which he made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt, and went and served other gods and worshiped them, gods whom they had not known and whom he had not allotted to them. Therefore the anger of the Lord was kindled against this land, bringing upon it all the curses written in this book. And the Lord uprooted them from their land in anger and fury and great wrath, and cast them into another land, as they are this day." So just imagine if that happened to us. All of a sudden, you could no longer come to St. John the Divine on Sunday, but instead had to go to, I don't think I'm going to name another church. That wouldn't be good. But let's just say you were forced instead on Sunday mornings to always go to McDonald's. Just that would be a big change in your life, right? Yes. Not for all of you. Just think there's a place where you identify, where you know God, where you understand who created you, and you will be cut off from this. It would be such a horror. From a human perspective, it appeared that the Hebrews' religion was totally discredited and inferior to the Assyrians and the Babylonian gods, as first the northern kingdom of Israel and then the southern kingdom of Judah fell to their enemies. However, God was showing his sovereignty in history by disciplining his people and displaying his power in a larger world context. So the book of Daniel is in two languages: Hebrew in chapters 1 and 8 through 12, and Aramaic in chapters 2 through 7. So why is it written in two different languages? So the Aramaic language section pertains to the Babylonian and Persian empires, while the Hebrew section that sandwiches the Aramaic section speaks of God's plan for his covenant people. Therefore, the covenant sections are written in the Old Covenant language, Hebrew. So, do you all remember what a covenant is? A covenant is an agreement between two people that they will keep with each other, that they are for each other. It's not like a contract. So if you have a contract with, let's say, a cable provider, and you don't pay your cable bill, what's going to happen to you? Nothing. If you are finally, you'll be cut off. That's what I mean. I meant to say not nothing. If you decide that you no longer want DirecTV, what do? You'll just replace them with somebody else. A covenant is so different. A covenant is, I would rather die than end this relationship with you. So one of the first covenants in the Old Testament is God making a covenant with Abraham. God tells Abraham, go out and slaughter these animals, and you put half the animal on this side, you put the other half animal on this side. I've made you all a group of dead animals this morning. And then the two parties are supposed to walk right in between the dead animals, as if to say, I would rather die and be like these animals than break covenant with you. So do you remember who walked through the dead animals? It wasn't God and Abraham, because God put Abraham into a deep sleep, and then God walked through the animals, symbolized by a torch, a light going through there. And what was God doing? God was basically saying, when we break covenant, I'll die. Abraham, you don't have to. That covenant goes down to us. When did God break the old covenant? At the cross. And who died? God died. Jesus died in our place for us. So when I talk about covenants, I'm talking about serious language and something that God does for us. All right. So chapters 1 through 6 record 6 historical narratives or stories in Daniel, while chapters 7 through 12 contain 4 visions which are almost exclusively predictive. The 6 narratives in chapters 1 through 6 are not a connected historical discourse, but share the biographical history of Daniel's and his 3 friends. What are his 3 friends' names? You basically said it, but you know what names you gave me? They're Babylonian names. Who can give me their Hebrew names? That'll come up on a slide earlier because I can't remember them either. So this section emphasizes the absolute sovereignty of God in the life of all nations. It's not only Judah. The people may be deported and the Jerusalem temple destroyed, but God remains supreme and can be found by his people in all circumstances. God also messes in their history, making miraculous things happen in the life of these 4 faithful men. The 4 visions in the second half of Daniel contain predictions of times in the future when the truth of God's universal kingdom will be of particular importance to God's people. But I'm going to focus on chapters 1 through 6. So the primary theological emphasis in Daniel is God's absolute sovereignty. And if you haven't gotten that point yet, you should, because I think I've said it about 18 times so far. In it, the fortunes of kings and the affairs of humans are subject to God's decrees. He can accomplish his purposes despite his people's failings and the Babylonian opposition. The miracles recorded in chapters 1 through 6 demonstrate God's sovereignty on behalf of his saints, a message that we need to hear today. We are the saints of God. He will work in our lives when we are faithful to him, and even when we aren't. When people claim the end is near and that everything is out of control, when worry, fear, and anxiety take over, we need to look to Daniel, the anti-hero who stood courageously for God in a difficult place for his life. So let's look at chapter 1. So Babylonia was in the southeastern part of modern-day Iraq, and the deportation moved God's people from west to east, similar to Adam and Eve being moved from west to east when God dispelled them from Eden. Along with the people, the Babylonians also took the sacred vessels of worship from the Jerusalem temple before they destroyed it, meaning the means of worshiping God were also in exile. So the people who were left behind in Jerusalem didn't even have all the sacred vessels. They went into exile as well. Nebuchadnezzar tried to assimilate the best of Judah into Babylonian culture by obliterating their religious and cultural practices. He attempted to turn the next generation of Jews into good Babylonians in a melting pot kind of way. He assigned the best of the Jewish youth with daily portions of food that he ate and the wine that he drank. However, 4 men resisted him: Daniel, and now you're going to get the Hebrew names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of the king's eunuchs gave them new names. Daniel became Belteshazzar. Hananiah he called Shadrach. Mishael he called Meshach. And Azariah he called Abednego. So take away a person's identity, and then perhaps you can turn them into whatever you want them to be. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. He chose to stand against the orders of the king. He chose his God above Nebuchadnezzar, no matter how bad the circumstances. The food and drink likely came from Babylonian cultic offerings and sacrifices. Daniel, through divine wisdom, devised a plan to keep his friends and himself undefiled. The 4 would experiment only eating vegetables for 10 days and then be compared with the other Hebrews who ate the Babylonian food. Like Solomon, God gave the four exceptional wisdom for their circumstances. And at the end of 10 days, their appearance was healthier than all the rest. And Nebuchadnezzar granted them a place of honor in his court. He sees that there's something different about these 4, so he raises their position within the court. Then we get to chapter 2. In chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream that troubled him. Where else do we find troubling dreams in the Old Testament? Genesis, associated around Joseph. So when we're looking at Daniel, we can think a little bit about Joseph. Nebuchadnezzar calls all his sages together and demands that they tell him the contents of his dream before interpreting it. It would be like one of you coming into my office and saying, "Reagan, tell me about this dream I had last night." And I would say to you, "Well, tell me what your dream was." And you would say, "No, you figure it out." Okay? That's what Nebuchadnezzar is doing. So none of these sages could do it, so he decides to have all of them put to death. Oh, what a nice guy Nebuchadnezzar is. Tell me my dream, and if you can't, I'm going to kill you. So diplomatically, Daniel steps forward to declare what the king dreamed and that he will interpret it. So this is not going to be a contest between the God of Israel and the God of Babylon, but between the worldly wisdom of Babylon and the supernatural wisdom of Daniel. Then Daniel went to his house, and he made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. When the situation seemed hopeless, God stepped in to reveal to Daniel what he needed to know. And not only did he and his friends avoid an unnecessary death, they found new elevated positions within the court. We can't help but notice how this event parallels the story of Joseph's interpretation of Pharaoh's dream in Genesis 41. Daniel basically told Nebuchadnezzar that God was reaching out to him personally. In response, Nebuchadnezzar revered Daniel, bowing down to him as Daniel represented God to the king. And then he placed him in a position of power over his empire. In Daniel, we learn that world rulers are under God's control. And when God chooses, he can make them acknowledge it. People in positions such as Daniel's prove God's wisdom before Gentile masters. How much more can we ordinary people, in the context of our ordinary lives, when we use biblical wisdom, divine wisdom in everyday situations? As we stay in communion with God through prayer and Bible reading and in community study and coming together, we too can have an impact on the world. In chapter 3, we find Nebuchadnezzar creating this golden image. So he made an image of gold, which was reflecting his dream, which I didn't even tell you about what was in the dream in chapter 2, whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. How much is that, people? Oh, it's 90 feet by 9 feet. He said, whoever does not fall down and worship this image shall immediately be cast into a burning, fiery furnace. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused the king's order. Then Nebuchadnezzar, in a furious rage, commanded that they be thrown into the furnace, asking, "Who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands?" And he had them tossed in, fully clothed and bound in ropes. Then King Nebuchadnezzar said, "But I see 4 men unbound walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt, and the appearance of the 4th is like a son of the gods." This is Nebuchadnezzar saying what he sees in this furnace. So apparently Nebuchadnezzar is the only one who sees the 4th man. So this 4th man is either a Christophany. What do I mean by Christophany? An appearance of Jesus before the incarnation, or an angel, as Nebuchadnezzar declares later in the chapter. In either case, there is a physical manifestation of God's saving presence with his faithful servants. And the king then has the 3 men released. So the story begins with the attempt to deny Judaism and its God any place in Babylon, and ends up with the recognition of God and his worship by faithful people. Part of the irony of the story is that these men gain more political power within the state after this rather than losing it. The power of paganism offers no threat to us because the power of God and the hope of salvation through resurrection are stronger and based in reality, as witnessed by Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Peter, John, Mary Magdalene, Paul, and all the saints through history. We do not need to fret about Gentile power. We have a mighty God. In chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar has another dream that Daniel interprets. And in this chapter, God teaches Nebuchadnezzar a lesson. He is subject to judgment. And in the end, he will need to look to God for salvation, to the real source of help, instead of pretending to be self-sufficient. He is king because the real king allows it. Again, I'm not telling you about the contents of the dream. It's about a tree that gets cut down and all these terrible things that happen. But what's interesting in chapter 4 is that Daniel cares about the king. My question is, would you care about the king? Okay? The king is somebody who's been threatening to take Daniel's life and the life of his friends all along, and yet Daniel has a heart for the king. My question to you is, why does Daniel have a heart for the king? Because Daniel sees God working through the king and reaching out to the king. And I also think it's because he sees the king created in the image of God. So what does this mean to us today? We got to be really careful when we talk about leaders of our city, our state, our country, and the world, and despise them. They are created in the image of God, all of them, whether we agree with them or not. And we need to be praying for them. Jesus had a heart for who? Everyone. He was always looking at those people on the outside and bringing them in. He was offering them salvation. He was offering them life. And we need to be in his business. All right, chapter 5. The handwriting on the wall. This will be really fast. King Belteshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. So we got a new king at this point. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Good move? No. Don't tick off God. Immediately, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. And the king saw the hand as it wrote. That must have been pretty scary looking. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. Daniel returns, and this is the writing that was inscribed, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter, says Daniel. Meaning, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, a chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. You see, Daniel keeps going to a better and better place politically, in a sense. But that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Just don't mess with God. He doesn't like that. All right, we get to chapter 6, and this is where I'm going to end. This is the famous Daniel in the lion's den. I think you know the story, so I won't spend too long on that. So Daniel was thrown into the lion's den because he did not follow King Darius's decree to only worship the king. As you know the story, God kept Daniel safe throughout the night. So I pick up the story in verse 19 of chapter 6. Then at daybreak, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The backstory is that the king was very sad that Daniel was put in the lion's den. He really liked Daniel a lot. It kind of reminds us of the story of Herod when he had to sever John the Baptist's head because he made this promise. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" And then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him, and also before you, O king. I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. And then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. So this is what the king is declaring to his empire. "Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion, people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions." What does Paul write? That one day every knee shall bow in heaven and on earth before Jesus the King. That message is the same message that we get by reading the prophet Daniel. Daniel is an anti-hero because he's looking forward to what's going to happen with our Messiah. I don't know if Daniel ever saw Jesus face to face in some vision or in some time when he was in Babylon. But we do know that Daniel kept his faith squarely in God and the promises of God. And God kept his promises because he sent us a Savior. A Savior who is created in the image of God, in the image of a man, the Son of Man, who we see in the 7th chapter of Daniel, who is given a kingdom that shall last forever and ever. And you and I are the benefits of that, and you and I can live day to day in this kingdom as we pray in the Lord's Prayer, that it may be the same on earth as it is in heaven, that God's kingdom reigns. Amen.